In an interview, someone asked the science fiction writer Ted Chiang, how do you define AI? And he said, a mistake in words made in 1956. It's neither artificial, nor is it intelligent. It is predictive statistics. And I do think I want to start today's conversation, given that everyone's coming in to it from different vantage points, with just a bit of language. We hear about predictive AI, generative AI, machine learning. What's going on, Sam?
I love that we're starting with history, because I was going to start in that point, which is whenever I think about buzz around something technological, you can always trace it further and further back the more you try, right? And so I come out of the world of video and technology and AI, and like when you start talking about the impact of video, you can go all the way back to Kodak bandits in 1890s or whatever if you want to. And I think it's also really important if we're going to think about the positive and the negative sides of AI to really come from an urge, actually a real desire to historicize it and contextualize it. So that's sort of my starting point when I think about this. And when I start to think about how we define the terms and how we grapple with like something really new like generative AI, but actually realize that it goes back a long way. So your 1950s example, like the origins of the kind of ChatGPT discussion and things like neural networks, which are behind what I spend a lot of time like deepfakes, is in the 1940s, right? Like that's when the first ideas are from. So this is not novel ideas necessarily, it's novel computing power, lots of data, new hardware, and perhaps an inclination to find a way to use them in a different way. And I also want to sort of name, and I know we're going to come back to this, that when we're thinking about how we might come up with critiques, I also want to name there's lots of people who've been making those critiques. And like we are going to make some critiques and make some recommendations, but I also want to recognize whenever in a space like this, we're sort of standing on the shoulders of giants as well. And like particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, like Black women scholars and activists who've been like the real advocates for how we think about AI and machine learning and some of these concepts. So sort of just starting from that place before we exoticize it. Let's talk about some words here. And it's funny, we were talking just before, I was like, if we'd been having this conversation 5 years ago, we might have been talking about big data, right? This sort of like idea of, which was the buzzword of a few years ago. And I think that's a big part of when we're talking about machine learning and artificial intelligence is we've got, 3 things coming together that enable a number of purposes. We've got a lot of data, we've got computational power, and we've got models that then turn that into something. And so if we're looking at machine learning, we're looking at kind of ways in which you take data and you categorize and predict, which we could just call data analysis probably if we were trying to be a little less fancy about it, right? So how do we start with something like machine learning, which probably we could also be talking about big data. And then how do we look at some of the things that are coming up now? And I think it's probably helpful to sort of think of a distinction, and I'm going to certainly spend most of my time today talking about generative AI, which is the new thing, but perhaps the old thing, right? If we go back to the, its antecedents. Perhaps the difference between those is you're looking in machine learning and kind of predictive AI. You're trying to take a whole bunch of historical data, categorize it, and predict from it, and use it in those ways to like refine something or predict. With generative AI, you're taking a set of content and you're creating new content based on that. You're creating new content that looks like some of the past content, but is new, right? And it's also important, and I think this is also a really good starting point when we start to talk about the experiences, and Andres was talking about ChatGPT of this, that it's mimicry, not comprehension. And that is a phrase, and I'm trying to remember who said it, which really helps me when I look at all of these kind of products from ChatGPT, is to think this is a mimic, not an intelligent actor, and maybe not for a while, not an intelligent actor. So maybe some of those terms that we want to use, and I think maybe we want to steer away from artificial intelligence and get back to machine learning and data analytics and really the nuts and bolts of what we're talking about in any specific tool.
I think that hype often operates as a barrier to entry for a lot of people. AI makes it seem like it's some, hyper-technical, crazy thing out there, but calling it big data, machine learning, understanding it as statistics helps you bring it back down to earth, which is wonderful. And so I know in our work, we treat AI, machine learning, this realm, as both an area to interrogate, right? It's something to evaluate. Like at the Markup, we will investigate student risk algorithms that determine what student is likely to fail out or not Surprise, it's biased. Or predictive policing algorithms that make similar analyses based on crime. So we often interrogate this, and I know you interrogate the use of generative AI. AI also exists as a way to enhance capabilities, efficiencies, and other things, which is there's a lot of excitement around that in these moments. So we're going to touch on both, but I want to start with you on sort of the first, on this as an area to interrogate, especially as we come up to 2024, a year that will be Democracy Thunderdome. You've been thinking about this for 5 years now with your Prepare Not Panic campaign. What are your insights and how are you thinking about what's coming down the pike next year?
Yeah, so for a little bit of context, and I don't know if folks are familiar with the work we do at Witness, but we work with human rights defenders and journalists globally who use video and technology. And about 5 years ago, we started looking at the impact of what now we'd call multimodal generative AI, which basically means the ability to create synthetic audio, videos, and images more easily, more effectively, and in a more commercialized way on the information ecosystems we work with globally. So we look at it from a very direct perspective of how you provide skills and tools to journalists, but also the infrastructure. And I know we're going to try and talk about this at multiple levels because it can't just be a Band-Aid or a resource for journalists without thinking about the infrastructure at the other side. I tend to come from the point of view of the negative side of it because that's what I've been seeing in the global work we do. And I tend to come from it from seeing how it also contributes to problems. So I think when we're thinking about generative AI from a negative point of view, we should also be thinking about related journalistic problems like mis and disinformation, state capture of media, under-resourcing of media, right? That's the sort of holistic viewpoint. We shouldn't dehistoricize it to what I said at the start. There's been a big shift this last year, which is, as we look towards 2024 and the 65-plus elections and other, critical events globally, we run these convenings where we bring together journalists and technologists and human rights defenders, and we ask them what they're seeing changing, and we help inform that. And it's basically, you could say it's getting easier, it's getting more commercialized, it's getting easier to do this at volume to create synthetic media. And the safeguards and the ways to protect ourselves against that explosion are not yet in place.
And for folks who don't know what synthetic media is.
So synthetic media is a lot of words. Again, this is again like one of those sort of places where the buzzwords bounce around, right? So 5 years ago, it was the deep fake apocalypse, right? Which was this idea of face swaps. And what a lot of people said it's actually not just about the idea you can swap a face. It's also you can create a fake audio or a fake image, and they called that synthetic media. And then about a year ago, we started talking about generative AI. And so in some sense, those terms all overlap with each other and are helpful to sort of break down. And so what we're seeing right now is a couple of things coming through really starkly from the front lines that I'll highlight on the kind of negative side. The first is journalists and others in civil society saying, don't put the blame and the pressure on us to handle this. It's not going to be enough to kind of say, look and see if you can spot, the Pope in the puffer jacket because he's got 6 fingers or he wears his signet ring on the wrong hand. This is putting the pressure point in the wrong place. And the reason it's the pressure point in the wrong place is for 2 reasons. One is that there is a huge gap in access to the tools and the skills for a broad, diverse range of journalists. That includes community media in the US. It includes some major newsrooms in the US, but it includes the majority of global majority news entities to be able to do the detection, to have the skills to make those judgments. And on the other side, there's no existing responsibility that goes up the pipeline to the platforms and the AI models to make it much easier for a journalist or a civil society activist. You've got problems at both ends. You're not resourcing or supporting the journalists, and you're not putting the pressure in the pipeline. And I'll end with just a note that I think is the harbinger for 2024, is we've been running this rapid response task force that's kind of a Band-Aid on the absence of support to local journalists, where journalists from the Global South primarily can escalate suspected deepfake synthetic media to a group of media forensics experts. And what you're seeing there is 2 things. One is it's hard to prove something's real, to prove something's AI generated. You can take a lot of time to do that. You get to 80% probability. By then the news cycle has moved on and someone is saying it was whatever they're claiming it was. They're saying it was or wasn't AI generated. And you're also seeing a lot of examples where people are dismissing real footage by saying it's AI generated, primarily audio, right? So there'll be a clip of compromising audio. The politician in question will say, that's not me, it's AI generated by the time you've done this work. And this is the bigger threat, is just this undermining that's happening. So when I look to 2024, I'm worried about the reality of AI much more easily accessible, the absence of skills for journalists, the absence of the policy response, and the fact that it's easier to claim that real stuff is false.
You know, for the last 2 days, I've heard a lot about serving the information needs of communities and identifying the various players that can serve in that way. And I think when we talk about how people can serve in the information ecosystem, it's important to recognize what is possible and what is unfair to ask.
Yeah.
And in your work, you talk about something called the detection equity gap that I would love for you to flesh out in the context of both, you know, journalists doing the work and also people who are committing acts of journalism or acts of information gathering. How does it map on to sort of their roles?
Yeah, so we talk about this, the detection equity gap, and it's really this idea that you have, and probably we should call it a detection access and equity gap, because it's really the overlap of the fact that the majority of journalists and also community leaders and others in an information ecosystem who maybe do acts of journalism or are critical intermediaries are excluded from the prioritization of how we develop technical responses to the threats of generative AI, the skills and the access to them, and that is disproportionately affecting the communities who are most vulnerable already to things like mis and disinfo, who are already marginalized and vulnerable, be it globally, but also within the US, right? Communities of color, Spanish language communities, others who are not part of that. So that's the detection equity gap. And I'm realizing we're going down this dark path of like how it's all going to go wrong. And I know there's also work that you're doing that's on the capabilities and like the possibilities, perhaps also through this same quite pragmatic lens. So I'd love to hear more about kind of where you're going on this.
Sure. So at the Markup, we often say that we use technology to investigate technology, right? So we come from a position of having great technical expertise, and that's how we can spot what is not working in various systems. And I think that's an important part of sort of the arms race that we're in to hold power to account. So we use these tools to do our work, and I tend to think of it in sort of three buckets. There's sort of the efficiencies, analysis, and delivery, and I'll talk about it in each three because I think there's a lot of opportunities for journalists. The first is efficiencies, and that's kind of what you hear about a lot when you hear about the hype around generative AI. So if you want to figure out how to introduce a panel, for example, you can use it to tell you how to do that. I find tools like Anthropic's Claude, for example, really useful to become efficient at, like something I had to do last week. I had to nominally watch hours and hours and hours of video of public testimony. I have 2 small children and a day job, so I did not have hours and hours and hours to watch the public testimony. You can take the transcript, upload it into something like Claude, get a summary with timestamps. So then you can go back and watch the underlying source material and see, do they actually say that or not? In terms of an efficiency, for journalists, investigative journalists, this is a huge value add, right? Like it's laborious, tough work. And if you could have some shortcuts while maintaining accuracy, so you still got to do the work to check it, it's huge. The analysis portion is something we would do a lot at the Markup using AI, often machine learning techniques, not generative AI, to interrogate and understand large data sets, but also to discover interesting things. So one of my favorite stories about how to use machine learning for investigative journalism is the following. So for folks who care about climate, which I hope is all of you, the issue of illegal mines is a really big issue, particularly in the Amazon. Now, how do you find an illegal, unregistered mine? You could walk around on the ground looking for it. You'll be dead real fast. So here's the conundrum. What do you do? How do you find them? You might get a tip and you find out about a place. So an enterprising journalist teamed up with an enterprising computer scientist and realized the following. If you have an illegal mine, you're trying to get something out of that mine, right? You're trying to get it out. You're trying to get in and out. What is a good tool for getting in and out? An airplane. If you have an airplane that you need to get in and out, do you know what you have? An airstrip that does that. You can see airstrips in satellite imagery. So the computer scientists trained a machine learning model to recognize what an airstrip looked like in satellites, in satellite imagery, and used it to detect in this perimeter of the Amazon in Brazil, detected 1,264 unregistered illegal mines from satellite imagery. If you had done that one-off, it would have taken years, but this was something that training the model was actually quite fast. In doing that, that ended up then being on the front page of the newspaper. There was an article in the New York Times about it, ended up being a big issue in the Brazilian elections, and resulted in the arrest of several people running a network of these illegal mines that were being used for narco-trafficking. So the analysis capabilities here, also huge for a time where reporters don't always have a lot of resources. There's also a delivery component of how you get the right audiences the information they need, which is a much longer tangent, but I did want to flag it. And so I think it's important to learn these tools so we can not only hold to account those who use them in ways that are nefarious, but also, like, you know, there's not enough journalists for all the things that need to be covered, and so any ways of getting those efficiencies or amping up our analysis feels valuable. So I know we have just a few minutes left, and we are at the end of the day. So when we're thinking about this space, as a person who's worked in it for a little bit, it feels like we're in this urgency moment, right? We have technology, frontier technology is taking off and moving at a breakneck speed. It feels like we have maybe a 2-3 year window, I would say, I don't know if you agree, to really figure out how to shape this future and these technologies so they serve people and not just market forces. So if you're a funder and you're sitting in this audience, trying to make sense of all of it and also then figure out how to intervene, support, and help, what would you do, Sam?
Yeah, I agree with the urgency. It's you named the campaign we've been running is called Prepare, Don't Panic, and generally I think it's like act on the preparation is what we need now in a really attentive way to the voices that are missing, right? So as funders are looking at that, like I've emphasized quite a lot, like the need to support the ecosystems of journalism to address the detection equity gap. I think that's important, but I also think that it's really critical that funders are thinking about the impact of the big picture of policy and technical infrastructure and regulatory development on this. There's a lot of action at the moment that's really trying to think, how are we going to regulate AI? How are we going to do it in ways that could be tremendously helpful to journalists in the news ecosystem or could be harmful? So I'll give one example as an area that Witness has been deeply involved in is the development of ways that you can understand where a piece of media comes from, how it was edited, how it was created with AI, which I think we're going to need those types of tools as we move forward, and they're part of the AI policy discussion. But at the same time, from a community, from journalism and free expression, we need to really ask questions as these technical infrastructure are being built. Is it going to be done in a way that will protect privacy, will protect journalistic freedoms? Are we going to require things in that way in which we build the infrastructure that may benefit some actors but really harm a news ecosystem? Right? Because those are the things that are actually going to impact almost everyone we work with. And so I want to sort of describe an urgency for funders, which is, I think, take on the challenge of supporting the news ecosystems you work with to be able to take on the capabilities, but also resist these harms at a very direct level. Listen to what they're saying about the harms. I think there's a lot of abstract discussion of harms that doesn't listen to what people are already experiencing. It jumps to the far, like, apocalyptic existential future. And then the third thing is really get engaged on trying to make sure there's a strong voice in this, both technical building, but also the infrastructure side and policy side, because it's really going to make a difference to what we can expect in the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, I think about this. So one theme that came through in the last couple of days is, you know, journalism navigates power, whether it navigates power by helping communities see each other, right? Or whether it's holding power quite explicitly to account. It is in constant relationship with the concept of power. And what technology does always, whether it is the car or the washing machine or airplanes or generative AI, is that it always reshapes power, right? It removes frictions in some places, adds harms that we don't understand. And so if journalism is about navigating power and technology is reshaping it, it is, I think, incumbent upon anyone who cares about this space to become conversant in it. And I like your point about being practical, tangible in it, right? So it's going to reshape power in a way that intersects with education and the future of work and climate and all of these other domains. And I think this is really a moment to be intersectional in our thinking and collaborative, because all of these problems will be interconnected. Sounds like another conference to have. Thank you so much, everyone. We're right at time. Thank you for a wonderful, wonderful couple of days, and thank you for your insights.
Well, and for you as well. Thank you. This was great.